Welcome back. Now, Sudan's Humanitarian Aid Commission says more than 3,000 humanitarian organizations operating in Sudan have completely ceased working since the current civil war broke out in mid April. Joining me now to unpack this further is Ayesha Kajee, an analyst, activist, and writer. Ayesha, assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining us.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Aisha, 2023, we are nearly at the end of this year. 2024 is going to be a new year. But if we look at the world around us, would you say there's turmoil? Looking at what's happening in Sudan, looking at what's happening in Palestine, looking what's happening in Myanmar, and the list goes on and on and on. Let's not
Mhm.
forget Yemen as well. Is the world in
Yemen,
turmoil?
Congo, yes, the world is in turmoil, or large parts of it are, and it is spilling over into neighboring countries in many of those conflict zones, and that includes Sudan, Congo, the hostilities in present day Palestine, in Myanmar, even in the Ukraine. There are regional and indeed even international effects of these wars, which is why we really need to be concerned that there is this much turmoil going on currently.
Now, coming back to Sudan, where we're seeing over 3,000 humanitarian organizations have reportedly stopped operations owing to the
Mhm.
war, the civil war that broke out in mid April. I know this was a big story at the time in April. I think it was Ramadan, and there was a lot of conversation around this. Over
Yes.
time, that conversation waned. Nobody has really been speaking about it. But what can you tell us? I mean, the suffering, we might have stopped speaking about it, but the suffering of the civilians in Sudan has continued. What can you tell us about that conflict so far?
Absolutely. Well, the conflict is essentially a conflict between two arms of the military. The commander of the Sudanese armed forces, the official army, headed by General Al Burhan, who was a very close associate of the former regime in Sudan, and the opposed by the so-called Rapid Support Forces, which were originally paramilitary armed by the Sudanese military years ago during the conflict in Darfur. This rapid support forces arose from the then so-called Janjaweed, but were adopted into the military forces because they were armed by the government of the time. Given Sudan's ouster of long-term strongman President al-Bashir several years ago, there was an agreement between the military and the civilians who had been fighting for his ouster that the military control of the interim government would end after a limited period. Unfortunately, the military did not cede control and then began fighting with the rapid support forces who allegedly wanted to end the military regime. But my experience of the leader of those forces, uh, commonly known as Degalo Hamiti, he is not someone to give up power easily either, and he's got, of course, a very strong base in Darfur. But of course, this particular conflict since April, since the so called civil war broke out, is now between Degalo's forces on the one hand, the so called rapid support forces, and the Sudanese armed forces, the official army on the other. Both are well armed. Neither is a guerrilla army. Both are well armed. And since this broke out in April, there's been an escalation such that about 12,000 civilians have been killed, and millions of Sudanese have been displaced both internally and outside the country. Literally, in the region of about 6.8 million was the latest estimate by the International Red Cross a few days ago. However, since then, two Red Cross workers were killed in an attack on its convoy on Sunday, and seven people injured. This was after both sides agreed to allow safe conduct for the International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, who are working in Sudan, to go and evacuate about 100 civilians who are extremely vulnerable in the capital of Khartoum at present. Despite the agreement by both sides that this could be done, that Red Cross convoy was attacked. Now, given that, it was a clearly marked convoy, all the vehicles in the convoy had the Red Cross markings, etc., and it was clearly identifiable. They were all clearly identifiable, both vehicles and personnel, as working for the International Committee of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. The Red Cross has issued a statement saying they are devastated. They're very heavily traumatized. And if people from this organization were known around the world, respected around the world, can be targeted, deliberately targeted, as in this attack on Sunday, then it's no wonder that, as you mentioned at the start of this interview, about 3,000 organizations, over 2,000 of them international humanitarian organizations, including 10 UN organizations, have actually ceased operations in Sudan. In addition, local humanitarian organizations and regional humanitarian organizations are also ceasing operations, pulling out of Sudan, because the situation there has become untenable for humanitarian workers as well as, of course, for civilians. So that's
I
it in
think
a
it's
nutshell.
it definitely is a sad situation unfolding in that part of the world. 12,000 people killed, 6.8 million displaced. Never a good situation. And now we're seeing humanitarian organizations in their thousands have ceased operations uh, under these dire circumstances. What effect is this going to have on ordinary Sudanese?
Well, ordinary Sudanese in the capital, particularly, and in the areas where fighting has been rife, have, as I said, been displaced, been unable to return to their homes to continue with their livelihoods. So many people are now starving. There are severe water shortages in some areas. There is a lack of communications infrastructure and transport infrastructure, much of which has been destroyed as a result of this war. And so when communications are patchy, and at worst, failing, that is a huge cause for concern, both for civilians and for humanitarian organizations, because it means that aid cannot get in even where aid is available. So as I said, there are people in Sudan who are at risk for their livelihoods because they've been unable to return home, those who have been displaced. And we spoke about the number earlier, an estimate of about between 6.6 and 6.8 million displaced people. Most of those, of course, are internally displaced. And it means they cannot go home, they cannot continue with their day-to-day lives, therefore they cannot earn a living. Many of them, particularly in the far-flung areas of Sudan, are pastoral farmers or cattle and camel herders. And if they cannot continue with their livelihoods, they cannot support their families, etc., they're at danger not only of immediate food scarcity, but also in the mid to long term of famine. Secondly, children are not getting an education. The education system is in shambles, even in areas where there isn't intense current fighting. Thirdly, women are at risk in this situation, particularly when troop convoys are in the area. And given that women do a lot of the manual work in Sudan, that is, it puts a further strain on family economics, if you will. Fourthly, many people, as I said earlier, have been killed. And in many cases, those killed have been the heads of households. So you're now running into the problem of child-headed household, extended families taking in members of their families to care for one another, etc. The same situation is very much on the rise in border areas, such as the border with Chad, for example, where people who have relatives across the border have left Sudan but are now placing an unbearable strain on those border areas in neighboring countries because of the outflux of refugees and displaced people. So there is a severe humanitarian crisis currently, and with humanitarian organizations pulling out, including, as I said, 10 UN organizations. The UN, by the way, in Sudan has stated that it's run out of money. So what you've got then is a situation that is dire indeed for civilians, for people who are not active in the hostilities. Those actively fighting apparently are still being paid. So perhaps their situation is not as dire as that of civilians.
Yeah, and then of course, I think we've actually run out of time. But just quickly, regional and continental organizations, what role do they have to play? Organizations such as the African Union in this
Well,
situation.
the African Union has ceded a lot of the mechanics of mediation to IGAD, which is the regional organization. And IGAD has recently said that when President Ruto of Kenya stepped into the mediation chair, if you will, of the quartet, he did so fairly reluctantly, apparently, because President Salva Kiir of South Sudan at the time had said he needed to step down because he had interests, personal interests with both sides in this conflict. So he stepped down. And now IGAD has said they're going to appoint a mediator for Sudan. When that will happen and whether that mediator will be acceptable to both sides in this conflict is another question entirely. So that's what's happening. 2 days ago, IGAD said that they were appointing a mediator, but that hasn't happened yet, and it does need to happen soon and fast. The other issue, of course, is that the African Union should perhaps be taking a more active role now in Sudan.
If ever I actually had a reason not to like humans, I've always said I don't like humans, but those just for social reasons. I don't really like socializing. But if there was really a reason, I think it's because of this. Why do we fight? Why do we fight to such an extent that we have to kill? And I mean, it's just terrible. But
Well, it's usually about power, Zahid, and it's about power and resources. And Sudan is an unusually rich country in many senses.
but humanity, Sister Aisha, humanity. Uh,
Absolutely.
okay, I think that's all we've got for today. But shukran so much for joining us.
Shukran jazilan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Alaikum salam. That was Sister Ayesha Kajee, political analyst, activist, and writer, speaking to us about the absolutely dire situation in Sudan. I mean, where do we really focus our attention at the moment? So many conflicts, so much heartbreak. It's really a sad situation, and uh, I mean, what can we really do in all of this? Uh, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue the show. Please stay tuned.